Response/reaction. So I'm actually not going to read this source out loud to you for once. I'm going to have you pause it in just a second, but I want you to write a thesis statement that you can prove with this source. And you're going to need to explain how this source proves your thesis statement. So go ahead and pause the video and do that. So last time we left off with our first Continental Congress, so let's talk about what they actually do. The thing is, the leaders of the colonies wanted to organize a much more coordinated response, and so that's when they are going to call for this meeting that is the first Continental Congress. Now, this meeting is of delegates from most of the colonies, and it's going to be held in 1774. It is specifically in response to the coercive acts. So if you want to say the coercive acts caused something, it definitely causes the first Continental Association. We're going to see at this meeting about 55 delegates present at one time or another. There is the more conservative element that wanted to compromise with Great Britain, but those with much stronger measures are going to prevail. These are going to be individuals like Samuel Adams, John and Patrick Henry, Christopher Gadsden. Basically, they're going to end up persuading their colleagues to endorse the Suffolk Resolves. Now, the Suffolk Resolves were a strongly worded resolution that denounced the coercive acts as unconstitutional, advised the people to arm, and called for general economic sanctions against the British. So 3 things: strongly worded resolutions, so we're saying that they're denouncing the coercive acts as all unconstitutional, they're advising the people to arm, and calling for a general economic sanction against the British. We're also going to see that this first Continental Congress is going to adopt the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. I'm going to talk about that later. And they're going to agree to establish the Continental Association. And I'm going to talk about that on the next slide. Really quick, I should mention that, keep in mind, like before, remember, we saw like royal governors trying to prevent these kinds of meetings from occurring. But the colonies are going to get around this by basically calling extra-legal public meetings expressly for this purpose. And in the end, actually all of the colonies are going to be present at some point or another, except for Georgia. So it forms the Continental Association. So what is the Continental Association going to do? Basically, the Continental Association is the ones that organize and enforce these economic sanctions against the British. They are going to, for instance, pledge that Americans are going to cut off all their imports from Britain. So that non-importation movement is going to start specifically on December 1st, 1774. So much more coordinated and organized this time. But then they took it a step further, and they said if the dispute was still not resolved by September of 1775, so we're going from December of 1774 all the way to September of 1775, the association is also going to call for the barring of most exports to Britain, as well as the West Indies. So no longer is it just, we're not going to import things from Great Britain, we're not going to sell things to Great Britain. And think about all those raw materials that Great Britain needed to manufacture a lot of their goods. On top of that, the Continental Association would say that all who violate these non-importation movement and the non-exportation movement would be considered enemies of American liberty. They're also going to issue a Declaration of Rights and Grievances. I mentioned this earlier. This is basically going to summarize their position. It's doing things like, it's like I said, summarizing their position overall, like condemning most of the steps taken by British authorities since like 1763. And then from there, they sent out addresses to the people of America, but also to the inhabitants of Great Britain, to the king himself, and even to Parliament, basically telling them of this wrongdoing Parliament has done to the American colonies. And in fact, when they sent these addresses to the king, they asked him to use his royal authority to interpose and protect his loyal subjects of America. Now, proceedings in both the First Continental Congress as well as proceedings that continue on with this Continental Association are going to reveal there is both division and agreement amongst these leaders of the colonies. For instance, we see it's at this meeting that Patrick Henry speaks very early on, and he says along the lines of, the distinction between a Virginian, Pennsylvanian, New Yorkers, and New Englanders are no more. I am not a Virginian, but an American. And so that's a really big deal, this idea of that being an American takes precedence over being a Virginian. And that's huge because, keep in mind that distrust between the colonies not that long ago during the French and Indian War. And another way that we see agreement is delegates, all of the delegates present are going to believe that the coercive acts were unconstitutional. The division really comes in that most of them would differ on how they should resist. For instance, a very, very, very small minority were prepared to take up arms against Great Britain. And in fact, most were just for protecting the interests of their own colonies. For instance, Virginia and Maryland, they wanted an embargo on exports not to happen until planters had finished shipping their current tobacco crop. That's why the non-exportation movement is so much later. And then on top of that, South Carolinian delegates actually threatened to walk away from the entire Continental Association and everything if this non-exportation movement contained rice in it. So even after we get to the non-exportation movement, they're still going to be allowed to sell rice. And Northerners basically have to agree to this exemption. So that tells you how much still a lot of the thought process at this time was very much pro one's colony, more so than pro the American colonies. The thing is, there wasn't just division within the leadership of the colonies either. After the Continental Association has been formed and this First Continental Congress has occurred, now Americans are basically forced to take sides. Are they for the Continental Association or are they against it? Quick note here, not even radicals are advocating for independence yet. No one is to that point yet, really. Really, a lot of American people from different colonies are going to be confident that this, resolute opposition to a tyrannical, oppressive ministry that is, Parliament, will mean that they will back down. Still, between 1774 and 1775, this confrontation of where they should side, or should they be for more colonial rights or more on the British side of all this, is going to grow more and more heated. You see lots of debates in newspapers and pamphlets, and things are becoming increasingly polarized. In fact, many Americans are expecting some sort of military confrontation to come about, though they do hope that the king would not resort to this. The atmosphere in the American colonies is becoming increasingly polarized, and it is pushing towards a military confrontation and driving a wedge between the American loyalists and the American patriots, or in other words, the American Tories and the American Whigs. Really quick, I got to define these terms because they're extremely important and you'll see them even on one of your papers. In fact, colonials that were advocating for colonial rights are going to call themselves Whigs. So when I use the term Whigs, or when you see the term Whigs, this is pretty interchangeable with patriots. So colonial rights on the American side, Whigs, patriots kind of thing. Whigs tends to be a term used earlier on. Patriots tends to be a term used more so once we get to the actual Revolutionary War. by choosing the term Whigs, they basically condemned their opponents to be known as the Tories. Now, this is actually going back to British history. Late 17th century Tories had supported the whole ascension of Catholic King James II, whereas Whigs had opposed it. So basically the Whigs were like taking on a name from previous British history, basically. Tories generally if they had the choice, they would have rather been really called the Loyalists. They are loyal to Great Britain. They're loyal to the king. So kind of think about that. Tories, Loyalists are pretty interchangeable as well. So I ask you this. I want you to think about it for a second. Why would one remain a Loyalist? Because we know where this is going to go, or hopefully you know where it's going to go. Spoilers, America eventually declares independence, becomes its own nation. So why would someone remain a Loyalist? And I want you to think about that for just a second. The thing is, when we're looking at these political divisions, Loyalists were no small group. They actually made up about 20% of the free population of the American colonies. Now, the other two numbers here, neutrals and patriots, I've seen multiple graphs by multiple different people. It's somewhere between 35 to 45 to 40 to 40 to 45 to 35. So it's kind of keep in mind that there's different information on that. But generally, it's pretty well agreed on that it's about 20% of the free population. A lot of times they were farmers, though actually if you look at like the number of office holders and professionals, we actually see we see a larger percentage of them being loyalists than the population at large. We also see a lot of new immigrants tend to be loyalists, partly because they don't have necessarily that American identity yet.